Hello and welcome to Key Elements of Community-Based Archiving. We hope to provide some information for you today that will help you be successfully prepared for preserving what you really want to preserve from your history. My name is Amanda Foge. I'm the head of special collections at Fondren Library at Rice University.
And I am Nori Guthrie, Special Collections Librarian and Archivist at the Fondren Library. As archivists, we are both passionate about preserving original materials to help people tell their stories and learn from other people's stories. As we'll mention in the description for this video, we have a link to a handout, which you may find useful as you think about your own archives. We will also share our contact information if you have any follow-up questions. So archival materials are items that are brought together to tell stories of a person, organization, or group. The items are often letters, photos, event programs, meeting minutes, scrapbooks, etc. They can be physical, and they can also be digital. These materials give us a glimpse into a slice of life in a particular place and time. As you can see in some of the items that we've placed on this slide, you can see the document on the left is an event program from a symposium here at Rice, highlighting the history of hip hop music in Houston. It lists rappers, DJs, artists who spoke. The photo features African-American students on our campus in 1973, just a few years after Rice was desegregated. There's also a cover for a scrapbook, a little thumb drive, and meeting minutes, which can be really important. So now we want to kind of have you think is like, there are all these materials that could be sitting out there and they could help tell a story, but they need to be, I guess maybe if you're thinking, like, what's the point of this? It's to make, you can think of like what archives make possible. So having archival information available to community or the larger public helps community and or local historians piece together the history of an organization, community, or a person's life. This can lead to creating accurate timelines, articles, and books. So for example, you're doing an oral history and someone provides a date for an event, but then you also have an event program and you also have some other things and you realize those dates may not all be exactly the same. You can make more strategic decisions when trying to create those kinds of timelines of when things actually happened. And then archives are also just about preservation of stories rather than lost history. So if items are not brought together in some way, then as people pass, as things are thrown away, those bits of history can be lost. And so archives are really great because you can bring that together and then people can try to piece together what that history is and tell those stories.
So now that we've talked a little bit about what archives are made of and how important they are, let's talk about different ways to collect them, to store them, and make them available to people. And so we'll start by talking about what community-based archives are versus what we'll call traditional archives. One definition of community-based archives that you see here is documentation of a group of people that share common interests and social, cultural, and historical heritage, usually created by the members of the group, being documented and maintained outside of a traditional archive. So a traditional archive, as described here, is a formal one that's established at a place that usually has paid archival staff. So that could be at a university or a historical society. It could be part of a public library. It could be a church. It just depends, but it's a place where they have physical space to store the archives. They have a system in place to describe the archives, and they have policies about who can see the archives. And they have spaces where people can come and use the archives. So a community-based archive is created by the members of the group, and it's maintained like outside of that more formal structure I just described of a traditional archive. And there may be various reasons why a group would want to maintain their archive outside of a traditional setup like that, such as the organization might be interested in creating full control of the archiving process and maintaining control over who can see and use the archives. For example, generally an archives at a traditional archive would be open to anyone who wanted to see it. Communities might like that approach, or they might prefer to provide their own preservation and access according to their own rules. So some examples of community-based archives. Churches sometimes maintain their own archives, such as registers of baptisms, marriages, or programs and flyers from events that they host. Churches have long-term shared physical space, and which everyone involved is aware of, and it helps stabilize the archives that they hold. You know, you could imagine that they would have some kind of a church office where these archives would be held, and everyone would be aware over the long term of the presence of that space and that materials are held there. Other groups, such as neighborhood organizations, grassroots political organizations, may have archives, but they may not have that shared physical space where everyone knows that that's home base physically for the organization. So that can be a bit of a challenge. It just requires some communication and planning to overcome a challenge like that. So it's not always easy to know about these archives if you're not part of the community, because they may or may not have a public presence online. Sometimes community archives that do exist are only known about in their own community and not beyond, either by choice to remain very private about themselves, or possibly by virtue of just not yet being organized to a point of sharing information about themselves widely. So one example of an archive with an online presence here in Houston is the J.D. Doyle Archives, focused on LGBTQ plus community in Houston. They have built the capacity to scan a lot of donated original materials and put them up online, as well as storing original materials in a physical space that is talked about publicly online. So it's a very visible archive in the sense that people can find materials online easily, and they know where they can make donations of similar material. This archive also has a succession plan for what happens when the main caretaker of the archives is no longer able to take care of the archives. So how would you get started if you're interested in developing your own community archive within your own organization? These are some key questions that you would want to think about. What items do you already have? Where and how are they stored? Who are your likely collaborators? So you could start by making an inventory of what you already have and where it is, and just start addressing these basic questions. And once you know those things, you would start to have a sense of what's missing from your story. And you would start talking to your community members about saving the kinds of things that you do want to save. And this is an example of an inventory format that you could use if this appeals to your organization. This is a document that has it's a basic table, or you could set it up as a spreadsheet. You could have this on a pencil and like paper pad kind of format, as long as you're gathering the information and communicating to your group about the effort that you're making. So this includes who gave the material, the name of the donor, their contact information, when they gave it, what the materials are, where they're stored, and if there are any restrictions on access to them. And so we have this example in the handout that is linked in the description below.
As Amanda said, there are some necessary questions to consider. What are you wanting to collect? That is actually a really important one because it'll help you with making decisions down the road. So for example, are you wanting to collect items that are just about a certain event or a certain community, and trying to think about what is the time span for that collection. And this will just kind of help you get a better sense, because if you're wanting to do an event, are you going to want to take all these personal items from a person that is not related to that event? These would be items that you may not want. And so kind of trying to really think about what the scope, what the plan is for that collection is important. Where will the materials live? If the materials have not been collected, are you going to create something called a deed of gift? And what that is, it shows the transfer of ownership from the donor to the community archive. And it can also cover any potential copyright considerations. Do they own copyright? Are they keeping their copyright? Or are they transferring copyright to you, etc.? And this would be on items like perhaps items that they have created. For example, maybe posters and they're the artist, for example. Who are the potential donors? And you need to consider what group will work on the archives. Who are the people that have the skills, or who are the people who really care about working with it? You want to think about describing materials and written guides. Who will make these lists? How will they be shared so people will know what is there? What about adding dates and names to materials when you know them? So for example, dating photographs, naming people who are in the photographs, finding people, perhaps the donor is able to do that for you, or you might have somebody who seems to know all the stuff about the community, then they might be able to provide that information for you. Do you need to consider how storage costs might be paid for? So this could also include folders, boxes, and the location itself. Using good archival materials, if possible, is really the best way to go to ensure the longevity of those items. You want them not to crumble away. You want them to be protected for the long term. And so after working through that part, there are some nitty-gritty kind of do's and don'ts to consider. Do put boxes on shelves. If you have a water incident, the items on the floor will be damaged. Don't put boxes under a water pipe, in the ceiling. If you know that's right there, maybe avoid that spot. Don't stick it near a window. It could get hot from heat, or the window could break, etc. And then another thing to think about is working with donors. You want to save your paperwork with them, right? You want to create relationships. You want to not pressure them to donate. Give them time. Each donor is different. Some want to donate very quickly and they're just like, I want to get rid of these things. I'm so glad you're taking them. Others, it could take years for them to feel comfortable giving it to you. And then others actually might only want to give it upon death. And so these are things to prepare yourself for, that there are these different kinds of relationships you'll have to form with donors, and to be respectful of them. And then, something I always mention to people is that archives can really be a waiting game. It can take years to get a collection from a person. And that's okay. It'll come when it comes, and it's good for the donor to feel comfortable with giving you those materials. And so we have a lot of, again, other tips and more in the checklist document that we'll be sharing with you. And then also just to know one more thing, in case you're already thinking about it, there's also some talk about how to deal with physical collections, how to organize them, and also starting to think about digital preservation, digital items. So next, you can think about building the collection. So you're getting in materials from people, but you feel like there might be more. You've already interacted with the donors that are giving materials very easily, and you're thinking, well, what other strategies can I use? You can think about, one thing that you can think about are oral histories. Oral histories are a really great way to fill in the gaps So for example, you don't have a photograph of a community center, the inside of it, but you can ask somebody what it looked like. And they can provide a description so they can help kind of fill in those gaps for you. And then another thing that you could do is you could set up a scanning day. So people could bring their materials to you, you scan them, they take their materials back, or they might feel so comfortable that they decide to donate them. And then you share those scanned images with them. So both of these strategies can be really great ways to gather stories. Now, there are things to consider though. Oral histories do require some organization to record and transcribe them and store them for the future. And then scanning days do require a plan for scanning equipment, people to do that scanning, and then how the files will be shared with the owners and how the archives will store those digital files, and make it possible in the future for people to see them.
So once you have a collection, an archive, it's time to think about planning for the future. Keeping the archives going and making it available to people will require some collaboration and agreement within the community, as well as some time spent to build awareness of the archives and the material in it. Sometimes these parts are the most challenging because people in the community may have differing ideas for how to approach these concerns. You will need an agreed upon long-term storage and access location. Where will these things be stored and how will people be able to get to them? You'll need to decide how you're going to let people know what you have. Will you have lists that you post online, for example? Or will you have a private communication channel such as neighborhood meetings in person where you talk about what's available? Can anyone access these materials or only certain people can access them? And how will this happen? Is there a contact person or a method that people should use to request that access? And what if the people who are working on the archives now all stopped working on it? And in our archives, we like to think about how will future us be able to provide access to these materials? So you can think about that in your own organization. How will future you be able to access these materials? How will other people know that the archives exist and where they are and how they can participate in carrying it forward? Those are really important conversations to have. And Nori talked a little bit already about copyright concerns, and I just want to bring that up a little bit for some additional notes. What is copyright anyway? We talk about that term, and sometimes it's good to take a moment and get specific about what it means. It is the specific way that you express your history or your art. It's your particular expression of this idea that's copyrighted. So for example, no one has copyright for Houston history in general, but individual people who wrote or created an expression of Houston history have copyright for their expression of it. And so copyright holders can keep their rights. It's not related to the physical expression of the work in the sense that I could own a painting that a person painted, but I don't have the copyright for that painting. I own the physical painting, but not the rights to it. So the same kind of model applies in archives. It's most common that archival materials are in an archive, and that archive does not have the copyright or the intellectual property for that material. It still belongs to the person who created it. Additionally, on this topic, I would like to say that people can't publish copyrighted materials without permission. So, they would need to seek permission from the copyright holder, That doesn't mean that they can't view the materials. They can view the materials and take notes and such. They just can't publish the material beyond what is known as fair use in copyright law, which would really just be a small portion of the work. And they would need to cite where the work came from. So that said, all of a sudden, it can seem like kind of a daunting task to set up and run a community-based archive that would be reasonably complete and available for the long term. It's certainly possible, and it just takes some communication and coordination for sure, and calling up on your community colleagues out there in the larger community for some help and resource sharing. You may have local institutions with archives programs that would be able to help you with training sessions, sort of an Archives 101 presentation that could be tailored to your group. You could communicate with an archive, a traditional archive that might be willing to work with you on such a presentation. It is possible to apply for 501c3 nonprofit status for your organization, which would really help with fundraising because it would make it possible for your group to receive tax-deductible donations from people. So it makes it easier for them to give to your organization. It also requires a certain level of formality in your organization, and that can build trust with financial donors as well. So it has that positive aspect. So you could build communities with other community-based archives that exist. If you need some help finding out what those are, there are national resources for community-based archives. There is something called the Community Archives Collaborative, which is a grant-funded program that might be able to help your organization. And links for this and other ideas for contacts are included in the handout that we mentioned that's linked in the description for this video. And then one other note that I wanted to give you is that it may be that your group or organization is already represented in some way in a traditional archive or an institutional archive. And you might like to work with them on describing the materials that they have. They would certainly be open to your ideas about description and enhancing description. For example, you might want to add more contextual information to what that archive has in your own words. Or you might want to suggest that that archive point to your archive so more people are aware of yours and what you have and how to contact you. Okay, so thank you so much for spending a moment with us talking about community-based archives. I hope that this presentation has given you a sense of the challenges and benefits to either way of preserving your story. We would just encourage you to definitely spend time thinking about preserving your story in whatever manner you prefer to do it. If you have questions and would like to follow up with us for more conversation or advice, this is our contact information for our department, which is the Woodson Research Center, also known as the Special Collections Department at Fondren Library, Rice University.